The family lineage I'm going to share with you begins with my maternal great-grandmother, Mary. Born in Portugal in 1910, her parents left her and her five brothers in Portugal while they left for America. In 1915, the heart of World War I, at just 5 years of age, my great-grandmother came to America. Alone! When her parents had sent for her, they had described two possible boats she could take, the Lusitania or the Roma. Her parents had assumed she had taken the much faster Lusitania, and were heartbroken after hearing it had been sunk at sea by a German U-boat. It wasn't until Christmas Eve, nearly 3 weeks later than her original arrival date, that she arrived at the doorstep of her parents' home. Once in America, she attended school, but was taken out in 5th grade. She would later work 2 jobs, one at the mechanic shop and the other in a garment district. When asked why she chose to work so hard, and in such hard professions, she simply stated that she wanted to have educated grandchildren and children. And educated children and grandchildren she had. My grandmother, Cecile Philippe, was born in 1935, raised in Fall River, Massachusetts, and had a great passion for school at a young age. In 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for president against Thomas E. Dewey. My grandmother distinctly remembers being forced to go to bed, as it was a school night, during the final election night. She awoke in the morning and saw a picture of Dewey on the newspaper. Indifferent to who had won the election, my grandmother would later find that the news was wrong, and that Roosevelt had in fact won the election. 100 miles away, in Connecticut, my grandfather James Samuel Oswald was also born in 1935. Both my grandparents were born into a world of warfare. An example of how close the war really was to my grandfather falls quite literally close to home. Around the age of 6 or 7, while he was in Connecticut, my grandfather looked out of the window to see a man parachuting into the woods behind his home. He told his mother, who after months of hearing constant fibs out of my grandfather, assumed it was another one of his white lies. It wasn't. It wasn't until the next morning did his parents learn that a German spy had been intercepted after he had parachuted in. After high school, my grandfather was offered a full ride to Virginia to play both baseball and basketball. Only room and board would have to be paid. Since money was tight and they saw little value in education, they said no and told him to get a job, and that would be more important than playing baseball and basketball. So he enlisted and was stationed in France, where he played basketball and baseball for the army, wearing his uniform a whopping 2 times. He was even drafted into the Major League Baseball League to the Indians after returning home. But my grandmother, who we met in New Jersey before the service and married in France, said that she wasn't ready to make her family live on the road with him. After returning to the States, they had 2 kids, my mother and uncle. After struggling to find work in New Jersey, they moved to California, where my grandfather sought work in the aerospace program, only to reach California and find the program was on its last limb. In order to support his family, my grandfather worked 2 jobs, one on the weekends moving furniture, and the other was at the Santa Monica Police Department. The 60s were a tough time to be a cop. The civil rights movement were recently over, and racism was still extremely present. In order to fight racism within the police force, my grandfather would invite African American officers and their families over to his home to ensure they felt welcome within it. During this time, he also saw the debilitating effects of drugs. He tells that due to the overwhelming drug use, criminals were apathetic about being arrested, or were so drugged up that they could resist to the point of self-injury in some cases. During the early 70s, the Cold War was well on its way, and the arms race had many on the edge of their seats. My grandfather was no exception. In 72, a large earthquake shook Southern California. My grandfather thought the shakes and flashes of light from bursting generators were missiles and bombs from the Russians. His first instinct? Run outside with police-issue firearms?
He remembered his badge, too, but not his shirt or pants. A 6'5" middle-aged man wielding a weapon, wearing nothing but his underwear, screaming at an earthquake about commie bastards, must have been quite the sight. As the 80s rolled in, my mother, who was born in '63, and my uncle were off at college and returned home for the Olympics in Los Angeles. They were especially excited as my grandfather had been hired by no other than football star/actor O.J. Simpson as a sort of personal security or bodyguard during the Olympics, especially during his turn of carrying the Olympic torch. Now, to the final generation of our story today. My mother, Daryl, born in '63, was born into a world of war also. The Cold War raged on, but a major event was the Bay of Pigs. While my mother doesn't remember it, it had a great impact on the U.S. around the time she was born. During middle and high school, she distinctly remembers running drills in case of a nuclear attack. School was made a priority for my mother and uncle, especially by my grandfather, who worked extra jobs to ensure his children would receive the education that was never available for him. The final event of notability that shaped both my parents' and my life was the terrorist attack on World Trade Centers in 2001. We both remember vividly watching the TV for updates and news about the attacks, especially interested as my mother was supposed to be flying into New York that day, but had received a last-minute confrontation and moved her trip back a week. In doing this project, I not only learned a lot about my family, but the effect that things across the world can have on even what seems to be the most boring of American families.